Hello, and welcome to the first lecture in my class, Psychological Aspects of Drug Use and Abuse. Now, some of you watching this video are enrolled in the class, PSYC 212, at North Dakota State University. Some of you may be just watching this video on YouTube. Either way, welcome, and I hope you find this lecture interesting, and indeed the lectures that follow and the rest of the content for the class interesting as well. Now in today's lecture I want to briefly describe what we'll be covering in this semester, but before I get there I'd like to highlight a few interesting news articles that have to do with drugs. The first of these is a news story that comes out of West Fargo, and that's actually just a few days ago, or at least before I recorded this video, and it concerns the sale of fentanyl at the West Fargo and Cheyenne high schools. Now, as you may already know, fentanyl is an opioid analgesic. Opioids are a class of drugs which are chemically or pharmacologically related to opium. Analgesics are a class of drugs which are used to treat pain. So combination of the two, you get a sense of what fentanyl does. It's a drug that's used to manage acute pain or sometimes to manage breakthrough pain. That's a situation in which you're experiencing pain that's being fairly well controlled by another drug, perhaps another opiate, but you're still having intermittent pain that kind of breaks through the management and puts you into suffering. If that's the case, your doctor may prescribe fentanyl to be used to manage that breakthrough pain. Fentanyl is also sometimes combined with other drugs, particularly benzodiazepines, and used for anesthesia during surgeries. It's an interesting drug. It's a useful drug, at least medically speaking, because it has relatively fast onset and a relatively short duration. So it's good for treating quickly, but not for very long, a sudden bout of pain or pain during a relatively brief episode in time. However, like many drugs in its class, indeed like many drugs generally speaking, there are some risks. And in the case of fentanyl, there are some serious risks of overdose on the drug which can lead to coma or even death. It's certainly something that we're concerned about here in this region, as are people in many regions around the country. The rise in the use and misuse of prescription drugs, especially opioid analgesics, is a significant public health problem and has been so for at least the last couple decades. Interestingly, the drug that's being sold in West Fargo is furanlyl fentanyl, which is a chemical analog of the drug fentanyl. Chemical analogs are drugs which are manufactured, they're synthesized in such a way as to have a chemical structure which is similar to, but not exactly the same as, another drug. Again, in this case it is fentanyl. Now the reasons why manufacturers might do this are many, but they can include trying to develop a new form of a drug which has greater efficacy or better safety. They can also include deliberately making analog structures so as to skirt or to bypass regulations for existing drugs. And there are rather complicated regulations around how opioid analgesics like fentanyl are manufactured and distributed and prescribed. If you're a manufacturer who is less than ethical, you might be motivated to create near approximations of a drug like fentanyl so you can sell it semi-legally on the gray market or over the internet. And actually, as a whole separate related issue, the manufacture of synthetic analog versions of drugs is itself an interesting and problematic public health crisis that's occurred over the last several decades. So there are many synthetic drugs out there, synthetic versions of marijuana, synthetic versions of LSD, synthetic versions of opiate analgesics, as we see here, that are all designed to be, if not exactly legal, at least semi-legal or easier to sell, to produce and to sell if you're not particularly ethical or not particularly concerned about the safety of your buyers. Now, reading a news story like this hopefully raises for you a number of different questions. So you might, for instance, be asking, well, how do different drugs work? Like, for instance, how does fentanyl work? How do other drugs which are opiates or analgesics work? How do they change the way we experience our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors? What about a drug like fentanyl makes it dangerous? Why is it that you can overdose or even die from an overdose of fentanyl? one of the points that I'm going to try to return to again and again throughout this semester is that we have to ask questions about drugs, because drugs are all around us. Even if we at the very moment are not using drugs, don't think of ourselves as drug users, drugs are part of the world, they're part of our lives, and we're obliged to think carefully about them. And that thinking process hopefully involves asking good questions and searching for answers. Now, reading this recent story reminded me of a news story I read almost a year ago, and this concerned a piece of research that had at the time been published in a journal from the American Medical Association, and it concerned the use of medical marijuana and the use of painkillers like fentanyl in different states which had recently enacted laws about the medical use of marijuana. The basic idea of this study, and I'll link to it on the Blackboard site for our class, is that there have been a handful of states which have laws allowing for the medical use of marijuana, and they've had those laws for a number of years. Those, for instance, include California, Oregon, and Washington, which have had medical marijuana laws since before 1999. And then more recently, there have been a number of states, including Alaska, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, Michigan, Montana, etc., who have moved to enact laws to make marijuana available for medical purposes. Now, the particular reasons why different states have made these moves are fairly complicated, but one argument that's sometimes made in favor of changing laws to allow marijuana to be used medically is that marijuana can be used effectively to manage pain, so say some folks, and that if we have medical marijuana available for pain management, people will be less inclined to use more dangerous drugs like the opioid analgesics. Now, in support of this argument, some of the research that these particular authors did showed that over time, the rates of mortality from opioid analgesic overdose have tended to increase. So if you just look across this graph here from 1999 to 2010, generally speaking, more and more people each year are dying from overdoses of opioid analgesics. And like I said earlier, that's not, unfortunately, that's not news to us. We've known about that for a couple decades. The misuse and the abuse of opioid analgesics is a big problem, and it results in a lot of injury and death. And you can also see here in this graph that in the slightly pale blue line, we see that increasing mortality over time for states which have medical marijuana laws, and we can see in the black line, the darker line, increasing mortality also in states that don't have medical marijuana laws. Now, if you just look at the graphs, or I'm sorry, if you look at these two lines, you might conclude that, yeah, in states which have medical marijuana laws, there tend to be, in any given year, higher levels of mortality than in states without medical marijuana laws. That's generally speaking true. So it's not that having medical marijuana laws means that there is no death by overdose from opioid analgesics. In fact, in states that have those laws, we see, at least in this data set, higher rates of mortality. But what the researchers who wrote up these analyses point out is that among states that have adopted these laws relatively recently, there's kind of a plateauing of the increase in mortality. So if you focus here just on the right-hand side of the graph, kind of years 2007 through 2010, when a number of states brought their marijuana laws online, the researchers argue that what you see is that increase stops and kind of flattens and even apparently starts to decline in the years 2009 to 2010 for those states with medical marijuana laws. In comparison, the states without medical marijuana laws see a relatively steady increase over that same time period. Indeed, the researchers attempted a second series of analyses that showed that if you count the number of years since a law has been enacted for medical marijuana in a given state, and for each year you track the change in mortality rate, that as more time goes by for a given state that's not adopted medical marijuana laws, we see a slight decline in mortality. This decline is not particularly steady. It hangs at about a 20% decline relative to pre-law levels. But as years go by, it seems to drop at least a little bit, out to, say, year 6 after a given state has adopted a medical marijuana law. The rates of mortality have declined by a little over 30% as compared to the years prior to when that given state has adopted those laws. So this is kind of interesting. It presents us with some data to think about the difference apparently, or the potential benefits of using one class of drugs as compared to another class of drugs. So just as a quick review, this class of drugs, the opioid analgesics, include the drug fentanyl, but also include a lot of other drugs, some of which you've probably heard of, like OxyContin and Vicodin. And as I said before, these drugs are powerful painkillers. They are very useful for medical purposes. If you talk to any doctor or nurse or healthcare professional who has any use with them, he or she will tell you, when used correctly, they can be very helpful for managing pain, especially very serious pain in people who really need the help. However, like I said before, these drugs can be fairly easily misused or abused, and in our own region of the country, that is in North Dakota, where I'm recording now, there have in recent years been a number of overdose deaths related to these drugs. So in 2014, there were in the Grand Forks region about 10 or 12 deaths related to fentanyl, which at the time was more than any other class of illegal drug. So not counting things like alcohol and cigarettes, alcohol especially being related to a lot of accidental deaths, drunk driving, etc. If you just look at the illegal drugs, or drugs which are being used illegally, fentanyl and other opioid analgesics are resulting in a relatively large number of deaths for a relatively small community, Grand Forks, North Dakota. More recently in Fargo in 2016, we're not even through 2016 yet at the time that I'm recording, there have already been about 10 deaths related to either fentanyl or heroin. Now clearly fentanyl is a medical drug which can be used legally. It can also be used illegally. Heroin's an illegal drug. I tried to disaggregate the deaths to figure out how many of those 10 are related to fentanyl, how many are related to heroin, but I couldn't find a precise disaggregation. But just in general, 10 deaths is a lot of deaths. Certainly it's very tragic for those families and friends involved. And that at least has something to do with the use of opiate drugs, whether opiate analgesic medications like fentanyl or heroin, a street opiate. So we have a class of drugs which are very good at treating pain, but which can be misused, and when they are misused can be quite dangerous or even deadly. Another class of drugs, or really one drug, it's medical marijuana, which has some interesting pain management effects. Now later in this semester I'll do a lecture or two actually where I talk about marijuana, and I talk about how among its other effects it does seem to dampen pain, make people less susceptible or less bothered by pain, so it can be potentially an alternative for pain management, especially an alternative which doesn't seem to carry the same risk for overdose and death. It's certainly people can have trouble with marijuana, and I will talk about that a little bit later in the semester, but there are few to no recorded deaths of overdose from marijuana or other cannabis-related products. So it seems at least potentially relatively safer than opiates, and some of the research I briefly touched on earlier kind of suggests that this may be the case, that if states adopt laws allowing marijuana to be used as a pain management medication, they may expect to see declines in the otherwise increasing levels of mortality associated with opiates. But this is safe, but how safe is it? How much safer is marijuana than using opiates or than using other classes of drugs? Again, this is a news story that is playing out in different states around the country. It's also relatively local to where I'm recording. In Moorhead, Minnesota, there is a medical marijuana dispensary that is scheduled to open up this summer. It's part of a company called Minnesota Medical Solutions. Interestingly, that clinic was scheduled to open last summer. I remember trying to contact the owners to conduct an interview for this class, but they hadn't yet opened. They pushed back the opening till this summer. I'm not exactly sure why, but I am very interested to meet the folks who work there and talk to them about the types of clients they see, the types of problems that people present for, so that I can understand better what is medical marijuana, how do people use it, is it in fact a safer alternative to other forms of medication, including some like the opiate analgesics, which can be in some cases potentially very dangerous. So like I said before, reading news stories like this, it's interesting. I try to do it almost every day. One of the reasons I do is it helps prompt me to ask interesting questions. So reading this news story over, learning a little bit about medical marijuana causes me, or hopefully causes you, to ask the question, what is medical marijuana? Is that any different from non-medical marijuana? What makes marijuana medical or not? Maybe asking more generally, why is marijuana illegal? In many places around the country, indeed many places around the world, it's a drug that's illegal to use for most people. And of course, you may be asking, what are the risks associated with marijuana? I kind of framed this as a comparison between two drug groups, one that's quite dangerous and one that seems relatively less dangerous. But if you're careful and you're thoughtful, you may be thinking, well, gosh, marijuana may be relatively safe, but it may still have its own risks or dangers associated with it. You may wonder, does marijuana use, maybe especially over long periods of time, damage the body or especially the brain? You may wonder, can people become addicted to marijuana? And you may even wonder if using marijuana increases the risk of using other drugs. So perhaps marijuana in and of itself isn't particularly dangerous, but does it increase the risk that you might, after using marijuana, graduate to using more dangerous drugs, which could really damage your health or even cost you your life? Like I said before, when you think about drugs, especially when you read news articles, especially news articles in your own local area about drugs, hopefully you have questions. Hopefully you start to wonder what's going on. If you do, I think you're touching on one of the really most important points about this class. Like I said before, drugs are part of the world around us. Almost everyone uses drugs at least at some point in their life. Even if you don't think of yourself as a drug user, you probably have used drugs fairly recently for one purpose or another. And even if you somehow have managed to not use any drugs for a very long time, you certainly know people who have used drugs. I would say we're obliged to think about drugs. They're part of the world around us. They're part of culture. They're part of the lifestyle that almost everyone leads. And thinking about drugs hopefully involves asking good questions and trying to find good answers to those questions. And that's a real motivation for me to run this class, for me to work on this class every year when I teach it. And hopefully it's a motivation for you to sign up for the class and pay attention to all these lectures and hopefully learn something. Okay, so what will you learn, or at least what will you learn today in this lecture? Well, in today's lecture, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the class, maybe make a little bit of an additional push for why I think you should take it. I'll review some of the topics that we'll cover in this semester. I'll talk a little bit about the format of the class and a little bit about the grading. So, about the class. Why should you take this class? Well, I think this class will give you an opportunity to learn about drug use and drug abuse, learn how different drugs have the effects that they have on humans, why some of these effects can be positive and why many of them can be negative. In a general sense, you can learn a lot about why people take drugs, and as I've mentioned in the previous slides, all of us, all people take some drugs at some points in our lives, and so I think it would be naive to say that drug use and drug abuse are uninteresting or unimportant to learn about. You can also learn a little bit about treatments for drug use disorders. I know many people who enroll in this class are contemplating careers in counseling or in psychology or in nursing or social work or psychiatry, or fields which may involve treating people who have drug use problems. Well, if you're one of those folks, or if you're just kind of curious, or if you know someone who has a drug use problem, you might want to know a little bit about what we can do to treat those problems, to lessen them, or to deal with some of the consequences that for some people can occur with drug use. And I guess another reason I would say you might want to take this class is it'll give you an opportunity to develop your critical thinking skills. And if you spent any amount of time around a university, you've heard the phrase critical thinking skills before. It may also almost be kind of a cliche in education at this point. But I would argue that learning about drugs is a great way to practice critical thinking, because the questions that we ask about drugs, whether certain drugs should be legal or illegal, how we should treat people who have drug use problems, etc., how we should deal with crimes associated with drug use. Those are tricky questions, and they don't have easy answers, and they never have historically, and they probably never will in the future. And thus, we really have to think carefully and critically when we try to answer those questions. To maybe put that same point in simpler language, I would say you have to think about drugs even if you don't use them. And again, probably most people, at least at some point in their lives, use some drugs. So what are the topics we'll cover? Well, this class is divided into 3 units. The first unit is just called Introduction to Drugs, and here's where I will be talking about patterns of drug use and drug use behavior. I'll talk a little bit about basic neurobiology and pharmacology to give you kind of a foundation for thinking about what drugs people use, why, or at least how some of those effects associated with those drugs occur, and so on. Once you have that foundation, you're ready to move on to Unit 2. This is the unit where we talk about specific drugs, both legal drugs and illegal drugs. And if you take a look at the syllabus for the class, you'll see that we cover many of the most commonly used and abused drugs. The last unit of the class, for the unfortunate reason of just timing, is a little bit shorter than the others. That's the unit on treatment. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where we talk about how we manage or treat or ameliorate drug use disorders. And although it's a short unit, I am going to try and fill it with some interesting information that will give you an idea of how counselors, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on typically work with folks who have drug use disorders. So if you're enrolled in this class, you've probably already looked at the syllabus, so you might know this already, but I'll repeat it. There are 2 texts for the class. They are both recommended but not required. The first text is Buzzed, the 4th edition. This is a book by Cynthia Kuhn and her colleagues about the straight facts about the most used and abused drugs from alcohol to ecstasy. It's a great book. It's widely available. You can get it online in electronic format or in paper format. You can rent it. You can get used copies. You can just buy it at the bookstore. You can buy it at a local area bookstore like Barnes & Noble. It's not expensive, and it gives you a rather broad introduction to a variety of different drugs. It's really well worth reading if you're at all interested in drugs. The second book, which is recommended but not required, is Mystyle and Colleagues, Drug Use and Abuse in the 7th edition. This is a more traditional textbook. It's a textbook that I used to require for this class, but I don't now require it. I just recommend it because I think, like Buzzed, it gives you a good overview of different drugs, some of what we know about why people use them, why they work the way they do, the types of problems people have with different drugs, and so on. Like Buzzed, it's available in different formats. You can get a paper copy, you can get electronic copies for rental, you can buy used copies. It's more expensive, but it's still, especially if you buy a used copy, not desperately expensive. And like the other book, it is recommended but not required. So if for any reason you decide you don't want it, you don't absolutely have to have it for this class. What you do have to have for this class is a student response system software called Tophat. This is one of those systems you may have seen in similar ones in other classes where you can answer questions live and in real time when I'm delivering a lecture. So if I'm lecturing, I'll pop up a question on the screen and you can answer multiple choice, or sometimes it'll be short answer, right ends, other things like that, so that I can assess in class how well you're understanding the material that we've covered. Now, Tophat's relatively new. I like it because it's not too expensive. A semester-long rental is less than $30, I think. It's $20 or $24, so not too expensive. It works on your smartphone, it works on your tablet, it works on your laptop. If you have an old school phone that only does SMS texting, that'll still work. So it's pretty easy to access. It is required for the class, and starting in the next class period, I'll be using it more or less throughout the semester. So the format of the class and the reason I chose Tophat is important. I'm doing what's sometimes called a flipped classroom approach, where you have to do some amount of work, you as the students do some amount of work outside of class, and then we do some different stuff inside of class. And what I mean by that is we'll be covering about 1 to 2 topics per week. And on your own time, I want you to watch video lectures like this one and take notes. And if you've bought the optional books, read them. And if you have access to Blackboard, which of course you should, ask questions in the discussion board. That's stuff you do on your own time whenever it fits your schedule to prepare for class. Then during class, you can ask me questions, raise your hand like you would in any other class. In class, we're also going to watch some videos that I've found that are interesting about drugs or treatment or so on. I'm going to try and arrange some guest speakers to visit our class during the course of the semester. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use Tophat to review some of the stuff you've learned outside of class. I'll be asking you questions. I'll be setting up little discussions that we can use Tophat to do in class, and that way I can get information about how well you're learning the material that I'm putting online in videos or on the discussion boards and so on. How does all of this work in terms of grading? Well, it's fairly simple. On your own time, you're watching these videos. I mentioned that earlier. You're taking notes, hopefully. You're maybe reading the book if you've chosen to purchase either of the books. And you'll also be doing homework quizzes. These will be about once per week. Usually they'll be assigned on Tuesday and due the following Tuesday. You do them entirely on Blackboard, and they're based on information in the lecture videos. There'll be 8 questions per quiz, I think. So across the whole semester, it works out to about 56 points that you can earn. That's the maximum if you got every single question on every homework quiz correct. On your own time, I'm also encouraging you to interact with me and with other students in the class in the discussion boards that are on Blackboard. You can respond to questions that I've posted. You can apply what you've learned in class to discussions that we're having. Discussion board participation is ungraded, but it's encouraged. I just encourage you to spend some time seeing what's going on Blackboard. I'm not going to grade you for your participation, so if you choose not to participate, you're not going to lose points. But again, please consider doing this. Now, in class or during class periods, like I said already, we'll be using Tophat. In almost every class, I'll be posting questions that are based on material in the lecture videos or in stuff that I've also presented in class period time. There'll be multiple questions in most classes, but 2 of them will be graded. So you can earn up to 2 points per class, and across the whole semester that works out to about 52 points total if you attended every class period and if you answered every one of the graded questions correctly. Now, the reason why only 2 graded questions are graded in each class is so that if you have to miss class, you don't lose a lot of points. So if you miss across the semester 1 or 2 classes, it probably won't affect your grade that much, and that's by design. However, if you miss lots of classes, you will lose lots of possible points and it will affect your grades. So please don't skip class, or if you are going to miss class and you have a good reason, something like extended illness or treatment, if you're on military deployment or something like that, please talk to me so we can make some other arrangements so that your grade doesn't suffer too much. During class periods, I'll also offer some exams. They're going to be 3 units, so they're 3-unit exams, and there's one cumulative final exam. It's a relatively small exam. If you add up all the points on all the questions on those exams, it totals to about 120. So if you think back over the last few slides, you can get the sense that approximately a quarter of your grade comes from taking quizzes based on the homework quizzes. About a quarter of your grade comes from doing in-class participation with Tophat, and about a half of the grade comes from your exams. If we total up all those points, it adds up to 228, and you can see here the different ranges of points totals that correspond to the different letter grades. I'll assign those at the end of the semester. This information is in the syllabus, as is some information about about extra credit options in this class. So if you haven't already done so, take a look at the syllabus. Okay, so by way of a preview, the next lecture will involve a little bit of a discussion of how we think about drugs, some of the messages about drug use that exist in our popular culture and our media, and also some of the basic definitions and categorization systems that we use to describe drug use and drug use behaviors. All right, well, thanks so much for your attention. If you made it this far, hopefully you can take a break and make yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Just relax. When you're ready, I'll be back in the next lecture, and I look forward to presenting some more interesting information for you. All right, bye-bye.